Welcome to the Creation Innovation Podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth King. Together, we'll have conversations with incredible human beings who have taken their creative outlet and turned it into something innovative. From people leaving the corporate world to be 8-figure entrepreneurs to people who have created books, created a family, or just creating to have fun in the world. We are all in a journey to create something amazing in our lives, and I hope that you find some inspiration of your own here. This is the Creation Innovation Podcast. Welcome back. Today we have Becca Chambers, who is going to be chatting. Welcome, Becca, first of all.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
She is a Chief Communication Officer for enterprise technology companies. She has gone through her own fertility journey, and she works now in neurodiversity. She's an advocate, and she is really doing a lot of amazing things in a lot of different areas. And so as we were just talking before we started to record, I had asked her about her own fertility journey. So Becca, would you mind sharing with our audience your story? Obviously, you're in the corporate world, and how did that go down?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, women's fertility timing always matches up with their career building timing as well, right? So, I was early in my career. As you said, I work in B2B tech. So, I was working in a cybersecurity company, which, for those who don't know, cybersecurity is very male dominated. And so, I worked in a long line of men above me. And so, it wasn't something that I felt like I could talk about. I had spent a couple of years trying to get pregnant, couldn't get pregnant, started to go through all of the various fertility treatments, start with the easier things and progress all the way to IVF. And through that whole process, I was struggling with my mental health too, as I'm sure most people who are going through fertility treatments can relate to. And I just felt very, very alone. Like I didn't have anybody to talk to. This was
How old
uh,
were you?
let's see, I was 29 when I started IVF. So I had been trying since I was 27 to get pregnant. And, and,
Did you have a diagnosis, or was it just
yeah, good
nothing to be
question.
found?
It was, I had unexplained fertility that then over time turned into you have bad eggs, but we don't know why. So bad eggs, not sure
Okay.
why. Then 15 years later, just a couple years ago, I found out that I have a connective tissue disorder, which is very likely the cause for the bad eggs. So found out many years later, but the unexplained
Interesting.
piece is a whole other, mind bending problem because it's just like, why, right? What's wrong with me? Why am I broken? And I think, again, this is
Right.
something that everyone who goes through fertility treatments feels the same. Like, I think that's actually what made me start talking about fertility stuff is just like the universal experience of people. And as I, was describing this story when I was early in my career, just didn't have anyone to tell. And it's hard enough to tell your manager when you're pregnant, but to tell your manager when you're struggling to get
Right.
pregnant, right? Like that's not something that people talk about. And so I was young and alone and it
Back
was
then, it was
horrible.
working from
An
back then,
office.
remote
Yeah,
working wasn't really a thing. You were in the office all day, and anyone who's gone through fertility knows you're at the doctor every other day. So, how did
totally.
you navigate that with saying you're coming in later or whatever it was?
It was really hard, and I don't know how I managed it. Like, I think about now, I have kids now, and I have to manage their schedules, and it going to the doctor every day sometimes, like you said, like, injections filled with hormones, like, I could get an email that would make me start crying from a coworker just because I was pumped full of hormones, plus I was feeling terrible about everything that was going on and my lack of fertility and all of that. God, it was just terrible. I feel so much for people that are going through it, and I hope that there are more online resources and groups now for people to talk to, because I think the worst part is the alone factor, right? I just feel very lonely doing this, even with your
Mhm.
spouse or your partner or, it's your body that's failing
Right.
you, or, maybe it's their body, but you're the one who is supposed to be carrying this thing. And I don't know, it certainly it took such a toll on me that I took time off of work, and it was unpaid time, but it was, I think my options were like, go to an inpatient mental help place, or take time off work and like really figure out how to move forward with my fertility journey. And I was very lucky that my first, no, my second round of IVF worked, and I got my first child out of that, which was the best thing ever. And then the second time I did IVF, I was in a new job with a female manager who had been through IVF herself. So as soon as I decided I'm going to start doing IVF again, because the doctor said you need to start this pretty soon, you've got the bad eggs, I went to her and I said, "Look, I'm going to do IVF. And so I'm going to need time off." And she was like, all for it, right? Let me know how I can help, because she had been there. I would never have been able to have that conversation, even with another female manager who hadn't been there, because it's such like you haven't gone through fertility stuff. You just don't really understand kind of the depth of it. And even if someone says to you, I have to go to the doctor every day, you're thinking, oh, maybe they're going for a checkup. You're not thinking, oh, you're going to have an 8-inch wand, like going penetrating you to look at your ovaries that are filled with eggs and painful. Like, there's so much to unpack with that.
For sure. So through that experience, and now I don't know how long ago this was, but obviously your career has gone beyond where you were before, and you have seen it from a different perspective now. How do you kind of manage down to your managers now and your subsequent direct reports with things that are going on? Is that an open conversation with fertility and miscarriage loss in the workplace? I know time and time again with my patients, I've been so um, amazed to hear with some of the large companies like Salesforce and others that are really great at, responding to things like that, that surprise me, even from the male's perspective. And I'm happy to hear that now. For you directly and personally, how do you see that? Is that more of are you open to share that in the workplace? Are you still kind of private about that because it is a private matter?
Yeah, I am just famously open about all of my personal things, whether it's health things, or I have, you mentioned neurodiversity
Amazing.
earlier. I have ADHD. It's something I talk about a lot. Um, I try to toe the line of not being too nosy. You're not supposed to ask women, right? Are you going to have another kid, right? Of course. That is not a
Right.
question. But when you have a personal relationship with somebody, I am really close with people on my team, for example. Um, at some point that does come up in conversation, right? And like, how do you kind of walk that
Right.
line of not overstepping while also showing the interest, that kind of opening the door to that conversation if that needs to happen, right? Like, if somebody knows that I've gone through this, or that I'm very open about my fertility journey, they might feel very comfortable to talk with me about it, right? But if we don't have the conversation, then maybe they don't know. So it is kind of towing that line. And like I said, like, I had this manager when I was going through IVF with my second child, who understood what I had been through, and that for me changed everything. It was very it changed my entire IVF experience, even like the IVF failure that I went through, which was devastating, of course. I could say to her, I need to not come to work today. I need to go cry. And she would understand what that meant. That wasn't just like, oh my God, this emotional
Right.
woman. So I
Right.
now in my career try to at least let people know the experiences that I've been through, so that if they do feel like they are going through something, even if it's not that, even it's something, any kind of kid related, mental health related, that the door is open for them to talk to me, and know that, psychologically, they have the safety to openly discuss what they're going through. They spend all of their time with me. We work people spend all of our time with each other, right? Going through these massive things in silence feels
Right.
like, um, fair.
Right. And that's kind of one of my initiatives that I've had on the table for the last few years is getting into corporations to let them know this is happening. I mean, 4 years ago it was 1 in 8, now it's 1 in 6. And I remember from my own experience just the production level of productivity, I should say, of the individual who's going through it is so you're so consumed by how am I going to get pregnant? What should I do? What doctor do I go to? Now Googling everything, and even more so that people are working from home, they have more freedom essentially to not have somebody looking over themselves in a cubicle, so to speak. But how do we increase that productivity while getting people the mental health and support that they need? That 1 in 6 people, couples are going through this in their organization. And whether they're talking about it or not talking about it, it's happening. So, we see a lot of Silicon Valley companies that have sound baths now and meditation rooms and services for massage and all kinds of things. And I'm saying we need to talk about fertility. This is such a major thing that people are not prepared to be talking about, yet they're talking about other things that may not be
Totally.
as um not to say they're not as important, but we're familiar with it, right? So if somebody's parent is going through cancer, let's say. I know
Yeah.
that's something that you've dealt with. We're familiar with what that means. If somebody's parent has had a heart attack or a stroke, we're familiar with what that situation is. With fertility, a lot of people still don't really know what that means. What does IVF mean? What does going through a fertility mean? What happens when you have an employee that's having a miscarriage and needs more than 2 days off to recover from that. And I think the more that we are open about those things in the workplace, the better the productivity is because they don't feel that they have to have that shame and guilt and hiding around because they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing when secretly they just want to get pregnant and they just want to make this happen. And we're seeing a lot
Totally.
more with same sex marriages and all these other things. There's so many other dynamics that go into it, the finances, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. So I just want to commend you for having an open dialogue with people about all of the things because it really does pioneer the path for other people to feel open and not ashamed about what's going on. Because the reality is, again, if 1 in 6 are is going through this, and 1 in 4 that we know of is having a miscarriage. By no means are you alone. It's just
Well,
the other people may not be talking about it.
and I think it's twofold, right? So you brought up, a sick parent or whatever. People can relate to that, right? Just like people can relate to infertility because it's 1 in 6. However, talking about, oh, my mom has cancer is a lot less uncomfortable than saying, my ovaries hurt or I'm bloated because I've been giving myself
Right,
injections or my bruise, like it's just you're talking about body parts that make people uncomfortable. And I used to joke, or I still joke when I talk about
right.
this, that a medical professional in Palo Alto has seen my vagina at some point over the past 5 years. Because during those years of fertility treatments, dozens of people had been up in my vagina, just like it was no thing. And just the word vagina makes people cringe, right? And like, it's not something you can talk
Right,
about at work. And how do you express to somebody? It's not just painful, it's not just expensive, it's violating, right? It's traumatizing. Like the whole experience of
right,
infertility treatments is, your body becomes this thing that other people are trying to fix, right? You just become this kind of like
mhm,
science project, for lack of a better word. Again, I deal with painful things with humor. So you'll see a lot of that come through here. But how do you have those conversations when the subject matter itself is absolutely kind of taboo? Like, just you can't talk about vaginas at work, you can't talk about menstruation at work either, right?
right,
Everybody knows that half of people menstruate, so there are tampons in the bathroom for you. Like, that's the
right.
extent of it. We're not talking about PMS in the workplace. I don't know. I think this is just one more of those because it's not squarely a women's issue, but the experience that women have in this is different than the experience that men have in this. And I think because of that, makes it an even harder thing to discuss than an already hard topic like that.
Absolutely. That's a whole nother. conversation, right? As you were saying earlier about telling your boss you're pregnant or maybe your male counterpart or whatever, and then thinking, "Oh, she's, how long is she gonna be away?" Or her productivity or her pregnancy brain or, all the comments that get made around that when the reality of pregnancy and women going through it is a lot that we really just, again, blow off of no big thing when it actually is a really big thing when you're building a human being in your body and all the science and data that goes to behind it to show what the women's brains go through to help another human grow.
Totally. Not to mention, like, everybody supports you after you've had your baby, right? Everyone is there for the, "Oh my gosh, congratulations. Let me make you food. Let me help you rest." And yes, that is absolutely necessary. Having a baby is a huge trauma to your body, a medical thing. But so is trying to get pregnant for a lot of people. So is being pregnant for a lot
Mhm.
of people, right? Trying to get pregnant for me was way harder on my body than being pregnant or delivering my babies. I had easy deliveries. I was lucky in that sense. But like, we don't talk about those other pieces. And I just think that we need to kind of look at pregnancy and childbirth all as like a kind of like a cycle of things, not just like it starts when you're pregnant and ends when you have your baby, and then we don't have conversations, about the before or after that go along with that.
Right. From sitting in your seat of where you're at with corporate comms and that sort of thing, what do you think is the answer to that and how to open those conversations? Is it starting with companies offering those as benefits so people know, okay, this is a thing that my company acknowledges is a thing. And therefore, when my boss maybe brings it up, it's not that unusual because it's something that my company offers? Or what do you think is kind of the way to open these conversations for people to feel comfortable in the workplace?
I'm sure that what you said is the right path, right? Is like the more formalized these things can be as like company policy, the easier it is for somebody to talk about. If there is company policy that, hey, we pay for your freezing your eggs, great. I can come in and say, "Hey, guess what?
Mhm.
I'm going to use my benefit and go
Right.
freeze my eggs." Like it just opens the door to that conversation. If that is not a benefit, like I'm not going to just go to my boss and, "Hey, guess what? I'm going to freeze my eggs." Although now I'm in a position that I may be able to do that. I certainly wasn't in a position 10 years ago when I had my first kid to do that. So, it also that
For
also
sure.
matters too. But I do think the way that companies talk about women and the way companies talk about women's issues and pregnancy and families and all of that in their corporate speak, right? Um, in their formal whatever, in their HR paperwork. I think all of that lends itself to the psychological safety to have these conversations. And that's at the corporate level. And then on the like team, individual, like what I can control as a manager, right? It comes down to being open, sharing my experience so that I don't have to put anyone on the spot and say, "Hey, tell me about your fertility journey." But like the door is open that like I do talk about this. So if anybody ever wants to talk to me about this, feel free, right? And then it doesn't feel awkward if in 2 years somebody's in that position and they wanna talk to me and say, "Hey, I remembered that you've gone through fertility treatments. Can we have a conversation about it?" And, I have found that that's true, not just about fertility, but any of these taboo topics. Like, the more you talk about it as an individual, the more you kind of disarm other people and make them feel comfortable to talk about it too.
Because I think what I've noticed with my clients and patients is there's this fear of if they know I'm going through this, they're going to think, again, I'm not as productive. Maybe they're going to give a project to somebody else or not going to give me as much work because not only do they know I'm trying to get pregnant, so maybe my mental health isn't where I would want it to be or they think it should be, et cetera. So then it kind of perpetuates the cycle of hiding it until you know that you can no longer hide it anymore. And that's where I feel like it's breaks down this whole cycle of the productivity of a team if we're operating that way.
But there's also the flip side, which is if you're hiding it, it's because you don't want opportunities taken away from you. But if you're open about it, people can say,
Correct.
"Hey, I'm not gonna overwork you to death because I recognize that you're going through this," right? But it is about empowering the person going through it with the choice and not having somebody else make that choice for them, which I think is what is the problem with stigmas, right? Is just assuming that like, oh, Becca's
Right.
trying to get pregnant, so yes, she's distracted or whatever. But maybe it's I'm trying to get pregnant and I need a distraction. So I'm going to put myself into my work and double down, but it means that I can't travel because I'm going to be doing IVF treatments, right? Like there is like somehow you need to
Right.
like strike the balance of you're not taking opportunities away from me because I'm doing it, but you're also allowing me to step back where I need to step back in order to empower me to go through the treatments, and save my mental health at the same time.
Right. And I think if you are lucky enough to have a manager that you can feel out to know, okay, they're open to having this conversation of how can we work together to for the whole team to be successful through this process of journey, right? Because sometimes people think, okay, I'm going to do IVF and it's one and done. Most of the time, that's not really the case. So knowing that who knows? We don't know how long it's gonna be, but if this is what you're going through, how can you have that support from all angles? And the more that we continue to have an open conversation and normalize all of these things, the easier and better off everyone is gonna be in the end. And I think a lot of it being in the news is also a little easier to have water cooler conversations about it, like, "Oh, did you see the Senate didn't pass this today?" Or, "Did
Yeah.
you see what happened with XYZ?" And then letting people know bit by bit of whatever you feel comfortable with to say, "This might be something that I'm going through," or, "Oh, yeah, my neighbor went through this," or, "Did you hear that Becca went through that?" Whatever, and maybe she can lead you to talk to your manager in some way or whatnot.
I totally agree, and as much as I don't love a lot of the news that's coming out about especially IVF, it does open the conversation. I think what's missing from the conversation is like the nuance of the experience, right? Like there is the we should be talking about fertility because it's healthcare and, there may be accommodations that are needed for people, but there's also the like kind of lack of understanding. I didn't know before I went through fertility treatments like how demanding it is on your body, right? Like how demanding it is on your time and your resources, just all of that. I think that there is something missing in the conversation about women going through this. It's are all of these milestones, and I think this is something I tried to explain to people when I was going through it. Let's use IVF as the example. It's like you start with can you even do it, right? Does everything look good enough to get started with the hormones? Okay, yes, good. Now we're going to start injections. We're going to look at your ovaries every day. Are there enough eggs developing? Yes. Okay, checkpoint, right? Then are there enough to do the retrieval? Yes. Okay, like is everything optimal to do the retrieval? Yes. Okay, did you get enough eggs from the retrieval or enough embryos? Oh, yeah, enough eggs. Then how many of them are good? Like every day, every week, there's some sort of checkpoint that is the stop or go point. It's not just like, oh, it
Yeah,
might be a little setback. It's like
right.
this ends the process every few days. And I think that like the lack of understanding around like how consuming, devastating, hard that is, let's say even everything goes right. That is still a very consuming and difficult process for somebody to go through. And I
For
don't
sure.
think that um, anyone who hasn't done it understands. And I wish there was some way to just make people know more about it so that if they find out that one of their coworkers is going through it, that from just a baseline of understanding, they have that feeling of, oh man, this must be just so hard. Not just because it's hard to get pregnant, but because they're living this like daily crush, really, of
Emotional
turmoil.
roller
Yeah,
coaster.
totally.
Yes. I quote all the time. The Mayo Clinic, which most people are familiar with, did a study that showed somebody who's going through a fertility journey is the same stress level as a cancer patient.
Yeah,
And that's where people start to realize, like, oh, okay, maybe that's like a thing. And so I
totally.
tell my clients too, you're not imagining how hard this is. There was a literal study done by one of the largest research universities that are medical places that are showing this, as well as Harvard has done a ton of studies around the stress level and fertility. And so I think it just validates for the layperson, so to speak, as you're referring to, in a sense that, oh, okay, this must mean that there's more to it than I don't know, right?
Yeah.
If they're saying it's the same stress level as somebody who has cancer, that's pretty big deal.
And you know what's interesting is when I was going through fertility treatments, obviously my husband was very involved in this process as well. Um, he didn't even understand kind of the depth of despair that I had, even though I was telling him, even though he was there, even though he saw it, it was like it the experience for him was not the same as it was for me, because for him he was like, well, we can just stop doing this, right, and then you won't be sad anymore.
Mhm.
But that's not how it works,
Right.
right? It's not just
Mhm.
like, oh, we'll stop doing, like, it's like
Right.
telling a cancer patient, like, hey, we'll just stop doing treatment and then you won't feel bad anymore. It's like, but that doesn't solve the kind of root problem of this. Yes, this all exacerbates it, but like doesn't solve where this pain is coming from in the first place. And I just think this notion of like, we can just, or you can just stop doing that. Like, why put yourself through it if it's causing you this much pain? That's such a dismissive way to think about people going through fertility treatments, because it's not like we choose to go through this. It's that we choose to have children, right? We want to have children. We're not choosing to put our
Right.
mind and body through
Mhm.
literally living hell, because none of us would choose to do that if we had the choice. I also joke, making babies
Right.
for most people is free and fun. You know what it was not for me? Free or fun. It was very expensive and very painful. Like, hated it, all of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for sharing your story and being so open about it, because I do think that it's really paving the way for people to not have that alone feeling and understand that the mental health that goes along with it is so important. And that's where, finding a therapist or a coach or somebody who's been through it that can relate to the journey, I think is so helpful. And what I wish we would have had on our path as well, because you kind of have this thought that, oh, I got this, I can do it, and then you realize, shoot, I don't got this. This sucks. And what do I do? Where do I go from here? It's a whole nother language that you're learning, and etc. So I think I just am grateful for anybody, and especially you that are have gone through it before others, to have the openness to share the story, because that is how we make progress in the world in all things, to let people know that there's somebody else there to support them.
100%.
So, is
And
there any advice that you would give to somebody who's starting down the road of maybe figuring out that it's not going to be as easy as they once had hoped?
I mean, I think you nailed it. I think having support from someone who isn't necessarily just your spouse or partner, support from somebody who's gone through it, who can, like you said, it's not just the vocabulary, but it's what to expect, the range of emotions that you're going to feel, and all of these things that doctors don't prepare you for. They can't prepare you for that. So having somebody who gets it and who can help kind of walk you through it. And like, if you can get your mind around what you're going to embark on, that helps make it less scary. And so I think what you said is find a person to talk to and get advice from and rely on. And I think that will change the experience for sure.
Well, thank you again for your time today, Becca. And I'm glad that you had your happy ending with your little ones.
I feel very fortunate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Creation Innovation Podcast. Make sure to follow us on Spotify for free episodes, and subscribe to the Creation Innovation Podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you choose to get your podcast. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening for a chance to receive a special gift. Yes, we actually do send out gifts. It's my favorite thing to do. So visit us at elizabethking.com/creation innovation for more information on how to enter. Every review counts, and we are so grateful. You can follow me at the official Elizabeth King on Instagram or TikTok. Until next time.